Welcome to day 2 and to our attempt at understanding Islamic extremism. We thought we'd start this morning with an easy topic and a calm one, and we'll get to it in a second. But this is also one of the sessions where we're going to use the audience response devices. Do you have them? Okay. So we're going to ask the question both before and after the session, and we'll see whether the needle has changed. And the question is, Scott, are U.S. boots on the ground the only way to defeat ISIS? So just out of your general knowledge of this situation, 1 for yes, 2 for no. We'll report the results afterwards after we re-ask the question. So you have 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 seconds before voting is no longer allowed. Okay, thank you. So why do they hate us? And who are they anyway? And should we hate them? And what is this all about? There's so much that Westerners don't know about Islam, just as we assume and assert that there's so much that Islam doesn't know about us. So to help us understand this, try to get some answers, and to eventually talk about ISIS, its perhaps most violent expression, we have 2 truly phenomenal experts in this area. Chase Robinson, to my right, is the president of the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. And besides that, and by the way, in case you haven't noticed, many of the people who work with or for Chase have been on other panels like Paul Krugman and Janet Gornick, and some others too.
David Nassau.
David Nassau, of course.
Andre Asselman.
Andre Asselman. Okay, 4 or 5 people from CUNY. Besides that, he is a scholar of the early Islamic period, right? And the bios are obviously more elaborated in the program. And to his right is Josh Landis, who is the director of the Middle East Center at the University of Oklahoma. They really have one there. And just so you know, because you're saying, what does this redhead know about this stuff? He grew up in the Middle East. His father worked there. He began speaking Arabic when I think he was a month old. Among the many things that Josh does, he writes a really interesting blog newspaper called SyriaComment.com. If you're interested in that part of the world, you really should check it out. And Josh is going to begin with kind of an overview of what's happened in the region over time, how we've gotten to this place, basically, and Chase is going to do some of the same. Have I got it right? You have. Okay, Josh.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you, Chase, for inviting me. I'd like to make an argument about what is happening and how to understand ISIS and the turmoil going on in particularly the Levant, the Iraq, Syria, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, the multi-ethnic, multi-religious part of the Ottoman Empire. And I'd like to make a comparison with Central Europe about nation building and the stage that the Middle East is in nation building. What I call the great sorting out. Why compare with Central Europe? First of all, it's the class of 1919. All the states from Poland down to Palestine. The borders were drawn at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, and they were the leftovers of these destroyed empires. The World War I was the empire-destroying war. The Russian Empire, German, Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman Empire for our purposes. So these states all had multi-ethnic, multi-religious peoples living cheek by jowl. No good way to draw borders. Tons of different people stuck together. By World War II, we're going to see a great sorting out in Central Europe. And that's something most of you are much more familiar with. But Poland was 64% Poles before the war. By the end of the war, it was 100% Polish. Czechoslovakia, 32% minorities. All of them gone by the end of World War II. The borders were not changed, but the people were changed in order to fit the borders. We know 6 million Jews exterminated. Ruthenians kicked out of Poland and otherwhere. At the end of the war, from 45 to 47, 12 to 13 million Germans ethnically cleansed. The Sudeten Germans, the Polish Germans, Hungarian, all cleaned out because they were the guilty minority in these countries that had been used by Hitler. This process that we saw, the great sorting out in Central Europe, we've seen it in Yugoslavia. You could even argue that we're seeing the ends of it in Ukraine now between the Russians and is taking place in the Middle East. If we look at Anatolia, the head of the Ottoman Empire, Anatolia was 20% Christian before 1914. By the end of the great Turkish national revolution, 1922, there's no more Christians, less than 1% today. The Armenians, you know what happened to them in the East. The Greek Orthodox, 1.5 million were sent to Greece, wiped out. If we go to, you can even look at little teeny Cyprus. This is Cyprus before 1960, after the Turkish invasion, 1973. Today, all the Turks and Muslims live in the north, the Greeks, Christians, the south. Great sorting out. Lebanon, the multi-ethnic land. Civil war, when the French left in 1946, the French and British from the Middle East, they had all left in the Levantine countries minorities with a big leg up. And every Levantine state was taken over by a minority. Lebanon, it was the Christian Maronites. Syria, it's going to be the Alawites. Iraq, the Sunnis, 20%. And in Palestine, as I'm going to argue, you can even wedge that in. But here is Lebanon, civil war. The Christians were left in control. By 1975, when the civil war breaks out, Christians were about a third, maybe a little more than a third of the population. The Muslims cried one man, one vote. They wanted power. Bloody civil war. 15 years, 150,000 people killed out of a country of 3 million, or 1.5 million, really, closer to 1.5 million at that time. So very high number of deaths, brutal war. For the minorities, they cling to power because if they lose, it's a zero-sum game. They're worried that they're going to be wiped out. If we look at Iraq, the Sunnis, the yellow part here in the west, 20% were in control. They got control under the British. The Ottomans, they'd been in control too. Saddam Hussein was a Sunni. The Ba'ath Party was an instrument for Sunni power, and the military was. When America invaded in 2003, what America was essentially doing was taking the Sunni minority from the top and casting them down to the bottom of society and catapulting the 60% Shiites, the dark green here, from the bottom of society to the top and giving them control. This, of course, unleashed an unholy ethnic sorting out. The Kurds have broken off under American tutelage, but the Sunnis have been fighting. This minority has been fighting for the last over a decade, hundreds of thousands dead, and it's not finished. They've become radicalized. ISIS, first Al-Qaeda, then ISIS, because they're fighting for their hunk of territory to regain control of Iraq or to keep a hunk. It could end up that they will be pushed out, like the Germans of Poland or Czechoslovakia. We don't know what's going to happen to them. But there is this the minorities, the Christians are gone, essentially, from the Yazidis, which you read about in the New York Times yesterday, taken as slaves, but they will be pushed out. Many other little minorities have already been destroyed. The great sorting out, which leaves us, let me even stick Israel-Palestine in this. Because Israel-Palestine, you get 1850 is about 4 or 5% Jewish, before the rise of Zionism. By the First World War, about 14% Jewish. The British take over. By the time the British leave in 48, it's a third Jewish. Of course, as soon as the British leave, the Palestinian Muslim forces think, we're going to take over and win this war. They lose spectacularly. The Jewish minority in Israel is the only minority in the Middle East which is able to turn itself into a majority. The Palestinians, of course, have been fighting tooth and nail, long and bloody, like all these other conflicts, to try to hold on because they see it as a zero-sum game. They're going to get pushed aside. Now, of course, Jews, to be fair to Jews in the Middle East, they've already been sorted out. Baghdad, the largest single religious community in Baghdad before First World War, was Jewish in Baghdad. Damascus, we can take, what's the great comedy about nothing that was done, TV comedy about nothing? Oof.
Seinfeld.
Seinfeld's from Aleppo. His mother is from Aleppo. His aunt was born in Aleppo. So all these Jewish communities, Aleppo, Damascus, Yemen, right across the Middle East, destroyed, as they were in Europe, collected in Palestine. This is part of this great sorting out in Central Europe in these states. So let me jump to my conclusion here, which is, I haven't really gotten to the Syrian part, but I will in the next things. The Syrian Alawites, the green part here, 12%, end up on the top in Syria because of the French and their military participation. And they have been ruling over the Sunnis, Sunni Arabs, who are 70% of the Syrian population. There's Kurds, there's other minorities as well, but most of those minorities look to the Alawites for protection. And their Alawites are fighting today tooth and nail to keep control of the government. And America is trying to destroy them, as well as the Western coalition, in order to empower the Sunnis to take over, once again, like they did with the Shiites in Iraq. Of course, we frame this in terms of democracy and freedom and apple pie. But in the Middle East, looking at it from the Middle East perspective, you're looking at it from this religious, ethnic perspective. And it all becomes very existential and dangerous. And it explains why this war has become so dangerous. There are, of course, policy implications to looking at it from this way. Can America adjudicate this great sorting out?
Should we?
And should we? And I'll end on that note.
Okay. So maybe I should have amended what I should probably have amended what I said right at the top about why do they hate us, because we now have a better sense of why they hate each other. Chase, why don't you take it from there?
Sure. Well, thanks, Josh. I'm not so sure you answered the question. No. Never mind. I certainly don't have an answer either. Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Ben and Donna. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's also a great pleasure to be part of that Graduate Center caravan of experts. You asked several questions in your opening comments, Michael, and there is an answer to one of them, the question being, do we hate them? The answer is pretty much yes. We know that. The Pew did a poll last summer, about a year ago, and they asked Americans to rate on a warmness thermometer, 0 being frozen, really chilly feelings, 100 being very warm. Asked Americans, where would you put Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews? And amongst Republicans, Muslims were the absolute bottom, about 40% on that warmth index. Amongst Democrats, Muslims were third from the bottom. Atheists and Mormons were less attractive to Democrats. So we do have an answer, and I'm not someone who subscribed to the idea that
You have an answer, a quantity. Well, you don't have a why, though, do you?
we don't have a why. I'm not someone who subscribes to this idea that Islamophobia explains everything. So let me just say a word or two about the religious background, primarily ideological, that can perhaps provide a context for one of the final points you made, Josh, which is that the particular modality of the sorting out in the Middle East currently is along sectarian lines. Why is it religious as opposed to something else? And I want to make one very, very simple point, and that is, let's be careful about vocabulary. Islam is a religion of 1.6 billion Muslims. The ideology, the religio-political ideology that ISIS advances is what we've come to call jihadism. When I was a graduate student, jihadism didn't exist. In fact, when I was a graduate student, going back now close to 25 years ago, Islamism didn't exist. We didn't have these terms. We spoke about fundamentalists. But in the last 25 years, we've come to use these terms, and I think with a fair amount of analytical precision. Islamic modernism, and here's my point about vocabulary, it's important. Islam is that religion of 1.6 billion people. Islamic modernism is the attempt that modern and contemporary Muslims make in order to make sense of their world, and there's a range. Everything from extremely conservative responses, which I'll describe in a moment, to what we would call extremely progressive responses that would advance women's rights, that would advance toleration and social inclusion. That's Islamic modernism. Islamism is a particular inflection of Islamic modernism, one which takes what Bruce Lincoln calls a maximalist view, which in short is that there is no difference between religion and politics. That is a particular inflection of modern Islamic thought, which virtually all Islamists hold to. That is to say, they wish, not unlike, for instance, well, Christian Reconstructionists, they wish to erect a theocracy. Now, jihadists are those who take jihad as the primary method by which they can construct an Islamic state. I'm not of the view that extraordinarily aberrant and destructive form of Islamic modernism that we now call jihadism has much legs. I don't think it does, but that's not to say it shouldn't be a matter of concern. It obviously is. Now, the particular form that state building, the theocracy, the ISIS theocracy is taking is what I like to call a kind of dystopian Islamic Disneyland. It doesn't really conform, we heard from Ambassador Burns a couple of days ago, an 8th century Islam. In fact, it's not an 8th century Islam at all. It uses some of the language, some of the terminology, some of the tropes, which I can talk about. But in fact, it's a radically, radically modern construction, which is part, as what Josh is saying, of this sorting out.
Okay, thanks. Let me ask you this. You mentioned, Chase, that we have data about everything, of course. We have data about who we hate and in what proportion. Josh, we talked about this, and maybe you can jump in here. It is the understanding of many people in the West that the hatred that is taught, formally taught in schools in places like Saudi Arabia, contributes to what's happening now. So why don't you tell us about how true it is that that hatred is actually taught, why it's being taught there, and what exactly the content is?
Everybody loves to blame Saudi Arabia, and I'm happy to blame Saudi Arabia.
Okay.
But I think the blame has to be spread a little bit more widely. Because if we look, I wrote an article not long ago about Islam in Syrian textbooks. And I was shocked at what I found, because it's not that different from Saudi Arabia. Even though there's a lot of Sufi Islam, and Syria has always fought against the Wahhabism of the Saudi Peninsula, you can see, for example, paganism and atheism. Okay, now half the world, from an Islamic point of view, are pagans and atheists. Because Islam puts people of the book, that means Muslims, Christians, Jews, as religions that are descended from God. Muslims see themselves at the end of this Abrahamic lineage. We're getting the third chapter, sort of the 1.3 upboot of the original Jewish 1.1. And then every few, hundreds of years, you're supposed to push the button and get the new update on your computer screen. And you've done that 3 times: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. So all of these religions that are descended from God are holy. But the ones that are not are animal, come out of your animal desires. And that's what it says in these books. It says, how should we deal
And
with
this is
paganism.
ninth grade.
This is ninth grade, but this is repeated in different ways. But ninth grade has a subsection on paganism and atheism. It's not long. It's only a few paragraphs because it clearly makes people uncomfortable, and they sort of tucked it in. But you can't avoid it if you are a monotheist.
But it makes who uncomfortable?
I think it makes Syrians uncomfortable.
Okay.
You see, the Alawites have been ruling Syria for 40 years. They're pagans in the eyes of Sunni orthodoxy. They've tried to say that they're Muslims, and they are Muslims by law, and anybody who says they're not ends up in a dungeon someplace in Syria. But they're not. From a classical Islamic point of view, they're seen as ghuluf, going beyond the bounds, because they deify Ali. And it says, how do you deal with pagans and atheists? You have to convert them or kill them. And this is why the Yazidis, so when ISIS takes over Yazidi territory, and they're a pre-Islamic religion, they fall into the pagan category, you have to convert or kill. And that's exactly what ISIS was doing. And that comes out of the ninth grade Syrian textbook. Now, obviously, we have separation of church and state in the United States. If Christians were in control of the curriculum and teaching how to deal with Jews or Muslims.
Well, there is something called creationism that has taken over some parts of
Well, you would have to go to hell. You know, what do you do for people who are going to hell? It would be a difficult problem. And Islam has this problem because we're, in a sense, in a pre-Enlightenment world where separation of church and state, Locke, Hume, don't form the basis of education. Right. So now let me just flip over, if I can, to one, I'm gone too far.
You're finding this uncomfortable?
I'm finding this uncomfortable.
Okay, well, we're going to have a debate. I can't.
Good.
Let me just go to what they say about Jews, because
we always want to know that.
Because why not? Here is the 10th grade textbook. How do you deal? What about Jews? And lots of Syrians will say, well, we make a distinction between Israelis, who are the enemy, and Jews, who are people of the book. But in the textbooks, there is no distinction. It says, Jews, the logic of justice requires the application of a single, inescapable verdict on the Jews, namely that their criminal intentions be turned against them and that they be eliminated from the entire Middle East. You can't have them as neighbors. Why not? Because they fought Muhammad in the early capitulation. They're untrustworthy, and their enemy characteristics are embedded in their personality of the Jews. This confirms that it is dangerous to live with or near them. This is what 10th grade, and I asked Syrians, well, what about this? And they don't ever remember learning this. Every Syrian I've asked says, no, we don't have this in our textbooks. And when I confront them with it, they said, oh, well, that's just garbage that's put in there by some imam, and we don't take those classes seriously. But you can see with the actions of ISIS
that some people take it seriously.
That these things have come back, and they've been used because they were sort of embedded there. And yes, people ignored them for a long time, but now they've been appropriated because they're useful in the great sorting out world, where Shiites become infidels. And that's what the real fight is about, is between Shiites and Sunnis, because Alawites are seen as Shiites. Iran is Shiite.
Chase is getting increasingly agitated. In his own quiet way.
It's a model of kind of decorum and modicum.
That's true.
Actually, I was feeling as if I did want to jump in and disagree, but I think I agree with much of what you're saying, although I would interpret things slightly differently. Islamic History 101 tells us what? The Islamic conquest took place in the 7th and 8th century. Conversion to Islam took, in some places, several generations. In more places, many centuries. In some places, never was complete. Of course, many of you will know there's a large Christian minority in Egypt called the Copts, 10, 15, 20%, depending on how one counts them. Here's the point. What you're describing, this grotesquely exclusionary, absolutist form of Sunni triumphalism, this purity that holds, that the very Muslims, and I'm not going to argue that Sunnis and Shiite families have been intermarrying for generations. That's not the case. There's been a lot of segregation, just the way there's historically lots of segregation in American cities between different ethnic groups. But for centuries, there's been a concordant, a kind of implicit understanding that not only would different varieties of Muslims cohabitate, coexist, but indeed non-Muslims. In fact, one of the great examples of precisely how plastic Islamic law can be, you mentioned, Josh, the people of the book. That's a category of Islamic social thinking and Islamic legal thinking, which holds that Jews and Christians and a group called the Sabiya, never mind about them, can be called people of the book and therefore receive certain social protections. Well, the enormous plasticity of Islamic law allowed Zoroastrians, in some cases, to be called people of the book. Now, Zoroastrians, by no standards, are monotheists who descend from in a biblical narrative. So my point is this. Here I think I'm agreeing with you for the most part, but underlining a point I already made, which is these are radically modern ideas, which are as repugnant to the vast majority of Muslims as they are to us, which is precisely why, if you look at the debate online in Arabic, and it's for the most part conducted in Arabic, although also in Urdu or in Turkish, Malay, a variety of Islamic languages, what you find is that those whom we call ISIS or jihadists are for the most part called Kharijites. Why are they called Kharijites? Kharijites were a long deceased Islamic sect that held that non-Kharijites, that is to say, non-Orthodox Muslims, in their view, were outside the Islamic pale. The Islamic community finds this exclusionary, this absolutism, this purity, as repugnant as we do. And that's why they're the subject of so much polemic.
I think even those of us who are not experts understand that what we find most disturbing about what's going on in the world, in that world today, is not something that reflects the vast majority of Muslims. It seems to reflect a small minority, but enough of a minority that we have panels like this, we have strategies being developed, we have the prospect of boots on the ground and another war in that area. So let me come at that in this way. I asked yesterday in the Iran panel, when we were talking about what to do about the Iranian nuclear program, I wondered why containment wasn't enough. If you come at the Iranian issue and say, even if they had the bomb, they're not going to use it because they know if they did, they'd be wiped out. Why do we have to go through all of this? Why do we have to have the prospect of war to wipe it out if, in fact, it's not ultimately a real threat? So my question to both of you is, why should we care? Shiite, Muslim, let them kill each other. You know, this is, by the way, I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, but this is something that many people are saying. It underlies the reluctance to go back to the region with boots on the ground or in any serious way. Things seem to be getting increasingly out of hand over there. But why should the West, you know, waste, so to speak, another soldier trying to mitigate, or otherwise deal with this issue and these people and their own problems? Either one of you can jump.
Okay, let me just respond first to Chase.
Okay.
I agree with everything you said. And there's been a convivienda that has existed in the Middle East for a long time. Of course, it's been punctuated by pogroms when the economic times are bad, but just as it was in Europe. But once you get a virulent nationalism like Nazism or fascism, it changes everything. One day, Yugoslavians are living together, and the next day, it's 7 nation states. One day, Ukrainians are living together. So it's not that this is always the way it is with Islam. It's a very modern process of state building, I would submit, that is being unleashed. And the secular Arab nationalism of the 60s has been replaced today by a religious nationalism, which is very tough, very exclusionary, and they're appropriating like mad. Everybody is searching for the most inflammatory paragraphs
Interpretation of
in order to put them together. And so
There's a competition. I mean, I think it's really important that we understand that there's a very ugly competition for radicalism between ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. And a lot of the theater of violence is, in a perverse way, ISIS demonstrating its chops as more violent, as more egregious, as more repugnant than other Islamist groups.
So why do we care?
So why do we care? I think
Why should
my
we?
question, if we go back to this big map of, here is a sort of, this is a little bit outdated now, but it's the prettiest in terms of colors. This is ISIS, the pink is ISIS, ruling from the edge of Baghdad all the way over to Aleppo. And it has carved out a state the size of Great Britain that is a Sunni state. And if you look at my model, if we play out my model, you've got two Shiite bookends. You've got a Shiite state in Baghdad. In the east over there, in the west, you've got the Alawites. That darker green is the government-controlled area on the coast. And these are two Shiite governments that have oppressed the Sunnis in the middle. Today, the Sunnis have captured their Sunni identity, and they're using that. ISIS has used it to carve out this big state and say, we're going to champion you. Now, America wants to come in and slice that state in half, put the Sunnis back under Shiite rule in Iraq, destroy all of this, and I don't know what they want to do in Syria. But America does not want to allow this sorting out to happen. We've got as our foot on the brake, trying to say, no, you're not allowed, you've got to stay Iraqis, you've got to stay Syrian. There can't be any rechanging of borders or national identity. That's a major tall order. This is the reason why we failed so spectacularly in Iraq. We were trying to do something that didn't fit the times, that was, your grandfather's conception of what the Middle East should be. So I guess to answer your question, I would say we can't adjudicate this. This is a process that is so much bigger than little America coming in there and ordering people how to think of themselves. And we can contain, we can do counterterrorism, we can protect Yazidis, for example, or we can choose our battles and say, yes, we want there to be a Kurdistan. We're going to make a Kurdistan. We're going to help these Kurds because they're very organized. They're good. They're going to be an ally of ours going forward. They'll give us bases and all these good accoutrements that we want for national security. But we can't tell everybody who to be.
Okay. Chase.
I think it's important that we understand that there are long-term, deep-standing, deep-seated reasons why this kind of radicalism takes root. Some of the ideas that ISIS used date from the early 20th century, and those were at that point a radical reinterpretation of the Islamic tradition, particularly jihad, a particular construction of jihad. If you look at the history of ISIS itself, it's an interesting history. It's a short history. The origins are 2003, 2004, as an Al-Qaeda offshoot. There is continuity from a historian's point of view from about 2003, 2004 to about 2010, and then something really interesting happens, which is the leadership shifts. The leadership changes radically. Up until 2009, 10, 11, if you look, insofar as we can tell, and the evidence is very bad, obviously, Jordanian, Yemeni, Afghan, a variety of different nationalities are constituting the leadership of what we'd now call ISIS. Starting in 2010 and 11, they become Iraqis. And what kind of Iraqis are they? Overwhelmingly Iraqis, again, so far as we can tell. They come from two different groups. One is former members of the Ba'ath Party. It's not as idiosyncratic or as strange as it may sound because there were Islamist cells within the Ba'ath Party and the army. And the second is those interned by Americans because of the war, radicalized in Iraqi jails. So, the unforeseen consequences of one attempt to solve breed the greater radicalization, which creates more problems. So I certainly subscribe to the containment. I think there's a moral argument to be made. When minorities are being decimated, there's a moral argument to be made. And one doesn't have to go as far as sometimes some members of the punditry would go. But I think within a framework of containment, predicated in part upon what I think is the structural weakness of this state, which which is a tiny, tiny state in terms of its infrastructure, in terms of its economic productivity. They're selling, much is made of their ability to sell oil. Well, they sell oil at a deeply discounted rate. They smuggle it to Kurdistan, to Turkey a little bit. It's hard to see that in its economic resources, it has the staying power to maintain a policy of containment.
Okay. On that note, let me just add one thing before we bring the lights up, please, and we'll have your questions. This feels familiar to me as a journalist over almost 40 years. Something doesn't have the staying power, and then all of a sudden it does, and it's there, and it's there, and it's growing, and it's growing. Okay, folks, we could go on for hours because this is really fascinating, but we want to involve you, so if bring the lights up, folks. We want to take your questions, and please understand there are a lot of passions. No comments. We're trying to gather information for all of our use after we leave this wonderful conference. So let's learn some stuff. Yes, sir. Can you just, we have mics coming around. Thank you.
Why does the United States seem so archaic? You talked about the word, looking at it as grandfathers, with old-fashioned ideas as to our power and what we can do to influence these people. What is it, no matter what administration we're in, Republican or Democrat, for the longest period of time, makes our foreign policy seem so obsolete in terms of our persuasion in this long, historic battle?
Well,
Go ahead.
I guess, America's position in the world has been transformed radically. From the end of the Second World War, where we had 60-something% of the world's capital, we made everything for the world. And we could push people around easily. In Iran, 1953, we could carry out a coup that put the Shah in power for $3 million. We embargoed Iran, not a drop of oil could get out of the country. And it starved within a few years, and there were demonstrations, and we could carry out a coup. We've been trying to do that in Iran for the last 30 years, and we failed. Even in Cuba, we've been trying to do it. We can't, Iran's a country of 80-something million people now. It's a middle-class country. The world wants its resources. So we don't have the power that we used to have. And the world's a much more sophisticated place. So I think it's very hard for Americans to come to grips with the fact that they can't sort the world out they can't be this role that we were after the Second World War.
Let me just add that there was another moment when we thought we could do this, which was right after the fall of the Soviet Union, when we were the lone superpower. Right. And here we are, 20 years later. I mean, this is all in our lifetime. That's one of the things that's so interesting about that. We've grown up seeing it on all ends, and we're still in this position. I'm sorry.
I think we're burdened by American exceptionalism. Somehow we're different, right? But there's something else, and I'm agreeing with Josh again. It's a multilateral world in which American economic hegemony is nothing the way it used to be. So what do? We hypercorrect with military force, and try to redraw maps. But of course, and I say this having attended Louis Lapham's session yesterday, in which he spoke very poignantly about the lessons one learns from history. The lessons that Bernard Lewis was teaching Wolfowitz and Cheney were not the right lessons of history. They weren't the lessons that Josh and I try to learn, and I think probably try to teach our students, which is humility. Watch out for hubris. Have some understanding of the deeper social causes.
Well, let me just jump in here and say then, aren't you, in a way, when you apply that to this region, affirming what I was saying? You're asking, in a larger context, how should America behave vis-a-vis this region? We want humility, pluralism in this region, inside the region, among competing forces like Sunnis and Shiites. They don't seem really eager to do that. I would say, by the way, parenthetically, that the same thing goes, for Israel and Palestine.
Our national religion, in a way, if I can interrupt you, is democracy.
Yes.
And
okay.
we have been trying to promote it and evangelize in the Middle East. And it's been quite dangerous because countries like Iraq and Syria were not at a historical, I would argue, at a historical point where they could sustain democracy because there were these tensions. They hadn't figured out all their national questions yet. And so once we did regime change, we opened up a Pandora's box, which we're trying to now close again, and we can't close it.
Okay. Yes, on the aisle. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone.
Merle Ginsburg, is it possible that we got into this fight 20 years ago when we were trying to protect what we thought were our interest in energy through oil production, and we wanted to keep some areas viable to continue to export? And now that we're becoming more energy sufficient in our own country, we can't figure out how to get out of this mess that we've created.
I think there's certainly something to the idea that oil is a very important variable. There is a point of view that holds that that our current policy, that is to say, a walking away from historical relationship to Saudi Arabia and a walking towards an attempt to create some kind of relationship with Iran, that those two are closely connected, and what connects them is the price of oil. Iran would not be at the bargaining table, so this argument holds, were it not for the fact that oil was trading at $40 or $50 a gallon rather than $100 a gallon. And Saudi, we wouldn't be quite so optimistic about our ability to have a policy in the Middle East independent, or at least at some distance from Saudi Arabia, were it not for the fact that we're looking after oil technologies that allow us to exercise more independence. So I think that's certainly a very important variable.
Let me just ask you. Yeah, go ahead.
If I could just jump in on that. The way I see, I agree with Chase. The way I see this is, in a sense, we beat Hitler in World War II at the hinge of fate, El Alamein and Stalingrad, because we denied Hitler oil and gas to run his war machine. He was going for oil in both of those big battles, trying to get to oil. He wasn't going for Moscow, he was going for Russian oil. We learned a lesson, the United States. Whoever controls oil is going to be the superpower. And we've had a hegemony over the Gulf, where 60, now a little bit less, 55% of all known oil reserves are stored for the last 50 years. And we've set up CENTCOM and all these other branches of our military to protect that oil. Today, we are moving towards self-sufficiency, and many people say, well, let's get the hell out of there. We don't need that oil. But if you want to be a world power, the superpower, how do you deal with a China that needs that oil? If China were to invade Taiwan, we can threaten them today by cutting off their oil supply because we own the Persian Gulf. We don't have to go and attack them. And I think that weighs that national security question of, do we want to relinquish the control of oil and allow the Chinese Navy to police the Persian Gulf? They're the biggest importers of Saudi oil today. 20% of their foreign oil comes from Iran. They want to move into the Middle East. They want to protect their oil channels. They should. It's their national security. But America's competing with them. If we let it go, then you're going to see people in New York Times complaining bloody murder that we're not at world power and where is American exceptionalism. It's a hard thing to let go of.
So you would argue that if in fact we're witnessing the beginning, we're well into a pivot toward Iran and away from Saudi Arabia, that's foolish? Because we need to control that oil in a more
I think our
serious
pivot
way?
to Asia just says that Asia is very important. But the way we, in a sense, have Asia, we influence Asia, is by this control over the sea lanes and the oil and the Persian Gulf. So we can't really, it's not we're going to dump Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is crucial. It makes us very uncomfortable because it's the home of Wahhabism. It's a medieval monarchy. It's exporting this very virulent form of Islam. So we're caught in this contradiction. And it underlies, every time you go to any conference in Washington, that's the big question. Should we be allied with what? How do we? We're stuck with this, and we're trying to deal with these two different, very polar opposite things. And
I'm sorry. We really do want to get to your question. Yes, sir.
Isn't some of this a profound, amazing lack of understanding of Islam and the difference between Shia and Sunni, and just some basic understanding? I mean, going into Iraq and expecting them to change overnight and, you know, welcome our religion of democracy versus, you know, trying to change the whole Islamic thing. It's just, and same thing here. It is amazing that we have this profound lack of respect for Islam and just religions in general.
Please.
I think we, if you look at the history of the social sciences in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years, what you see is a really significant change. Josh and I think were probably trained at the kind of the Indian summer of a kind of traditional modernization theory in which religion was really going away. That modernity was the single phenomenon which was closely correlated with secularism. That was, I think, more or less. I mean, I think the critique of that was starting to take hold in the 80s, but it really took the events of the 80s and 90s for social scientists in general, political science, historians, and all the rest, to say, you know, maybe there are, the term is often multiple modernities. Maybe there are many ways in which people construct their relationship with the modern. So I share your frustration. I find it astonishing. Not so much that we, as more or less insular Americans, having inherited that framework of secularization, would feel that way. But I was living in the UK at the time in the Iraq War. I mean, it's not as if people weren't protesting in the streets against it. It's not as if experts weren't saying, this is a really bad idea, it's going to go badly. That was being said over and over and over and over again, which, you know, leads to the completely unoriginal conclusion that those making decisions were not being guided by evidence. They were being guided by something else. And I suppose, you know, this sounds a little bit depressing as an academic, as someone who likes to think that ideas matter. Boy, those, I mean, it really was made clear that these were bad ideas. So I suppose that's, as it were, a clarion call for an even more vigorous public sphere and the role of universities and academics to raise their voices.
Okay, we're almost at the end of our time, so let me go back to what's behind the question we asked at the beginning and we're about to re-ask. Given what you guys know now and everything that we've heard and you've been saying, and the threat that ISIS poses both in the region and, it's said, to the wider world, do we have to kill it? Now, Chase believes that it will wither away on its own, or I'm probably misinterpreting what you said earlier. So let me avoid you and ask Josh, must we destroy them?
I think we can contain, but I think what we're seeing is the real redrawing of the map of the world, in a sense. If we look at the rise of nationalism, as the French Revolution, American Revolution, and this earthquake that's been sort of, you know, we get First World War where you have 20-something new nations. Between Second World War and 1973, something like 100 new states got their independence and came onto the world stage. They're sorting themselves out. I think what we're seeing in the Levant here and this Arab Spring is a canary in a coal mine to a degree. That Central African Republic and Nigeria, we're going to see this incredible youth bulge, unemployment, bad government, education that's dodgy. We're going to see this, other states be overwhelmed. That flow of refugees going from Libya to Europe is just the beginning of a trickle. I think that the lower half, just as there's an income gap in the United States that's broadening like this, there's a world income gap where there's the winner nations like China, South Africa, Brazil, the India, who are getting their poor into the middle class. But there are others that are not, that are failing with bad government, and they're going to crumble. And the world is moving. We just read about the world's going to be, what, 11 billion or something. There are intense pressures that are coming on. America does not want to get its sunk into this tar pit here. we can't manage it. And that's would be, we're going to see more of these problems of the sorting out nature, whether it's in Central Africa or other, and we can't control it. So we have to manage it as best as we can, a little counterterrorism. We have to help the refugees.
Little of this, little of that.
Little
Right.
this, little of that.
Okay. Chase, last one.
Thank you, Michael. I think I'd like to endorse what Josh is saying and provide a little bit of historical context. If you start with the Treaty of Westphalia and go into, late 19th, early 20th century, or subscribing to Josh's point of view, the Second World War, that is the kind of terminal point of the sorting out of, amongst European polities, well, that's 3 centuries. There are deep structures here, ethnic, demographic, confessional. After all, these confessional affiliations are 1,000, 1,200, 1,400 years old. It should not expect us that those deep, that it's going to take this region a century or 2 or 3. So, do I think will it wither away? Depends what the it is, right? If I had to bet, I think it's possible that we're in a moment in which we're starting to see the incipient signs of a Sunni nationalism that will take the form of a different condominium between religion and state, which will be affiliated with Sunnism and which will describe a new kind of fertile crescent. Do I think that the extraordinarily radical, Sharia-based, intolerant brand of state building that ISIS represents, do I think that has legs? No.
Okay. So I think what we've learned is that the mess is a mess. And but we've learned a great deal. I've found this very illuminating. I'm sure you have too. We're about to, we don't have time for any more questions, but we're about to vote again. So please pick up your devices and let's see if the needle has moved on the question. Are U.S. boots on the ground the only way to defeat ISIS? And you can, maybe we should have reordered it, but we can't right now. You know, should we go in to defeat ISIS? So please vote. And let's see what happened. Okay? And the answer is, this is like the Oscars.
No, before. Okay.
After.
90.
Oh.
Man, the power.
Stay out. Okay. Thank you. This is, we moved the needle on Iran yesterday, and we moved the needle here. And I think it's safe to say these are the only 2 sessions so far where argument actually caused people to change their minds until they leave. Thank you very much. You guys were terrific.
Yeah.